Rodrigo stood in the hospital corridor, lacking the courage to enter. Inside, Renata held the son he hadn't even known existed, and now that he did know, everything he had built began to crumble. Rodrigo stood in the corridor for 40 minutes. He didn't go in. The nurse passed him twice. The second time, she asked if he needed anything. He said no. She left without insisting, with that practiced discretion of those who learn early that hospital corridors hold stories that don't ask for witnesses. He kept looking at the closed door of room 214. Inside was a son who had existed for 25 weeks without him knowing. A son who had grown in silence while he signed legal notices, while he announced his engagement to the whole world, while he crafted a version of events where Renata was the problem, and he was simply the man who had moved on. 40 minutes in the corridor were enough for Rodrigo Cavalcante to understand something. No meeting, no lawyer, and no well-constructed narrative had managed to make him understand before. He had lost something he didn't know he had until the moment he could no longer pretend not to see it. He left the hospital without speaking to anyone. Renata remained hospitalized for 2 days, as was protocol. 2 days during which room 214 received Patricia morning and afternoon, Dr. Conceição on her routine rounds, and Mr. Afonso, who appeared on the afternoon of the second day with Mrs. Claudia, who entered holding a small bouquet of simple flowers with slightly trembling hands, and stood near the door until Renata said, "You can come in, Mrs. Claudia," with a voice devoid of bitterness. And that was enough for the other woman to cross the room and place the bouquet on the table, unable to speak aloud. It wasn't a time for grand words. It was a time for presence. And some people understand that better than others. Mr. Afonso stood for a while, looking at his grandson without speaking. When he finally spoke, it was low, almost to himself. "He has the eyes from the side of the family I like best." Patricia, who was on the other side of the bed, made a sound that was on the border between laughter and tears. Renata said nothing, but there was something on her face at that moment. Not exactly a smile, but the relaxation of someone who had finally arrived at a place after a long journey. Rodrigo did not return during the 2 days of her hospital stay. He sent a text message on the morning of the second day, short, without flourishes. "How are you? Can I come today?" Renata read it. She showed it to Dr. Fernanda Luth, who had stopped by the hospital the day before for a quick visit and had left clear instructions. "Any communication with him, show me before you reply." The lawyer read the message. She remained silent for a second. "Reply that you are well and that you will let him know when you are ready to receive visitors." Nothing more. Renata replied exactly that. Rodrigo read it in less than a minute, then didn't reply. She left the hospital on a Saturday morning with her son in her arms, Patricia by her side, and a suitcase her sister had packed with that silent competence of someone who makes things happen without needing recognition. The apartment felt different. Not physically. Patricia had organized the nursery in the preceding weeks. Everything simple, functional, chosen by Renata, piece by piece, within the budget she had managed with the same care she had managed the cash flow of an entire company. But there was a difference that wasn't in the furniture. It was in the air. The apartment, which had been called that unnecessary studio apartment, was now the center of the world. Renata placed her son in the crib, watched him for a moment, and then went to the kitchen, made coffee, and sat in the window chair. The same chair where she had sat the night she discovered her pregnancy, her hands trembling with a rage whose form she hadn't yet understood. She knew now. It had taken the form of a son sleeping in the next room, of documents that had dismantled a false narrative, of a CFO position waiting, of a name that had emerged cleaner than it had entered. She drank her coffee slowly, looking out the window. The city made its normal Saturday morning noise, indifferent, constant, real, and Renata Suarez, for the first time in months, felt no urgency to extinguish it. Rodrigo called the following Monday. She answered. She had agreed with Dr. Fernanda that she would answer, controlled, with boundaries, without room for verbal negotiation that had no witness. "I want to see my son," he said directly, without preamble. His voice had that texture of someone trying to regain firmness in a situation where firmness no longer had anything to lean on. "I know," she replied. "My lawyer will contact your lawyer this week to define visitation terms." A pause. "Visitation terms?" he repeated, as if the words had a taste he hadn't expected. "Yes, that's how it works, Rodrigo. He's my son. I don't need you." "Do you have a lawyer?" she said, with the same calm as always, neither raising nor lowering her voice. "He has Dr. Fernanda's contact. It's through her." She hung up. She held the phone in her hand for a second. There was no trembling, no excessive satisfaction. There was only the objective clarity of someone who knows exactly where they are standing and will not be moved by vocal pressure. What Renata didn't know and learned 2 days later from Mr. Afonso, who learned from the company's accountant, was that the previous week had been difficult for Rodrigo in a way that couldn't be captured in a Monday phone call. The dinner at the Gran Veneto had left a trail, not the kind of trail that disappears with time, but the kind that lingers, that circulates in water-cooler conversations, in business lunches, in that invisible but absolutely real space where reputation is built and unbuilt without anyone needing to sign anything. 2 of the investors present at that dinner had, in the following days, postponed scheduled meetings with Rodrigo. Not cancelled, but postponed. With that professional politeness that is, in practice, the most expensive way of saying, "We are re-evaluating." The accountant who had been hired to build a case against Renata had terminated his contract with Cavalcante Solutions by email, with a week's notice, without detailed explanation, but with a sentence Rodrigo had read 3 times, and which Mr. Afonso had reproduced for Renata with the precision of someone who knows every word matters. "I prefer to avoid involvement in reviews whose original documents contradict the conclusions expected to be reached." Elegant, devastating, and there was more. Isabella had moved out of his apartment, taking her suitcases on a weekday afternoon. Renata already knew that. What she didn't know was what had happened afterward. Isabella had hired her own lawyer. She had filed a paternity suit and claims for relationship rights and pregnancy-related expenses. She had posted on her own social media, without mentioning names, but with enough details for those who knew the story, a sequence of messages about women who are discarded when convenient and remembered when useful. The business world read it. It always does. Rodrigo Cavalcante, who had begun the month as a celebrated fiancé and euphoric father-to-be, ended the week surrounded by 3 simultaneous fronts. Renata's lawyer documenting paternity terms, Isabella's lawyer seeking relationship rights, and 2 investors who had postponed meetings indefinitely. Mr. Afonso recounted all these with the voice of someone reporting facts, not someone gloating. There was in him the specific sadness of a father watching his son reap what he sowed and being able to do nothing but bear witness. "He called me yesterday," the old man said at the end. "Asked me to intervene, to talk to you, to the investors, to everyone." Renata remained quiet for a second. "And what did you say?" "I said he didn't need intervention. He needed consequences." Mr. Afonso paused. "And that this time, I wasn't going to pull him away from those consequences." On Thursday of that same week, Renata went to Novum Distribution's office for the first time since the director's call, not to start. Her start date had been set for 6 weeks later, enough time for her to organize herself with her son and her new routine. But the director had requested an informal, preliminary conversation for alignment, and she had accepted. The office was on the 12th floor of the same building where she had had her first interview. The difference was that this time, the receptionist greeted her by name, without consulting any list, and the director came out of his office to greet her in the hallway instead of waiting for her to enter. A small gesture. Enormous weight for those who understand the language of how people are received in places. The conversation lasted an hour. He presented the company's structure, the challenges of the financial sector, and what he expected from the position. She listened, asked precise questions, and took notes by hand. The same habit she had noticed in Dr. Fernanda and recognized as a mark of someone who takes what's in front of them seriously. At the end, when she stood to leave, the director said, "Mr. Afonso Cavalcante told me something when he called me that I haven't forgotten. He said, 'You are the kind of person who makes a company better just by being in it.'" He looked at her with the seriousness of someone who doesn't use praise as a protocol. So far, I have no reason to doubt it. She didn't respond with false modesty or excessive gratitude. She just met his gaze with the same direct look as always. "See you in 6 weeks." On Friday, Dr. Fernanda sent a message with a PDF attached. It was the formal response from Rodrigo's lawyer to the terms of paternity and financial responsibility she had sent the previous week. Renata opened and read it. Rodrigo's lawyer had responded with a counter-proposal. The amounts were lower than legally mandated. The visitation terms requested more than agreed upon. And there was a clause buried in the middle of the document, in technical, more present language, that attempted to link the paternity agreement to a declaration from Renata that there had been no irregularities in her termination process from the company. She forwarded it to Dr. Fernanda with one line, "Saw the clause." The reply arrived in 2 minutes. "Me too. Tomorrow we respond, and that response will cost him dearly. Renata placed her phone on the table. From the next room, her son made a small sound, not crying, just the sound of someone waking up and not yet having decided how to feel about being awake. She stood up, went in, looked at him for a moment. In that document, Rodrigo had tried to use his son as a bargaining chip in a negotiation about the company. He had mixed the two things with the calculated precision of someone who still believes that control is a matter of well-drafted paperwork. What he still hadn't understood, was that every such move didn't weaken Renata. It documented him. And Renata Suarez had a lawyer who knew exactly what to do with documentation. She picked up her son, went back to the window chair. Outside, the city remained indifferent, constant, real. And somewhere in that city, Rodrigo Cavalcante was about to discover that trying to control what has already slipped from one's hands recovers nothing. It only tightens the knot. The news arrived on a Tuesday morning through the kind of channel that has no official name but works better than any formal announcement. It was Patricia who sent the message at 8 a.m. with a link and 3 words before it. Did you see this? Renata was breastfeeding when her phone vibrated. She looked at the screen with the care of someone who had learned that an early morning message from a sister could be anything between a cake recipe and the world changed while you slept. This time it was the latter. The link led to the business column of the Business Chronicle, the same outlet that had published Rodrigo's engagement announcement weeks before. With a photo, with an enthusiastic note, with a mention of Isabella's pregnancy as the greatest joy of his life. The new note had no photo. It had 3 short paragraphs written with the professional dryness of someone reporting a fact without needing to comment on it, because the fact comments on itself. Ativa Group Investments, one of the 2 investors present at the Grand Veneto dinner, had formalized the suspension of negotiations with Cavalcante Solutions. The group's note did not mention a specific reason. It used the expression strategic portfolio reassessment, which, in the vocabulary of the business world, means, with surgical precision, it's not the money, it's you. The amount under negotiation was $4,200,000. Renata read it twice, placed her phone on the sofa, and continued what she was doing, her son in her arms, the morning light pouring through the window with that unhurried Tuesday glow. There was no satisfaction on her face. There was something deeper and quieter than satisfaction. It was the silent recognition of someone who had sowed honesty in a long field and was finally seeing the earth return what it had received, for the right side and for the wrong side. She replied to Patricia. Saw it. Her sister sent an emoji, just one that said everything that needed to be said. Rodrigo learned of the publication before arriving at the office. His press agent, a 30-year-old man who had been hired 6 months earlier precisely to manage Cavalcante Solutions' public image, called at 7:48 a.m. with a voice that tried to balance professionalism and urgency and was failing at both. The note came out in the Chronicle. We need a statement today. Rodrigo was in his car. He remained silent for 3 seconds. The kind of silence that occurs when information confirms something the body already knew, but the mind was still refusing. Who gave them the information? I don't know yet. It could have come from Ativa Group itself. It could have come from someone at the dinner. Find out, he said, and hung up. The problem with that question was that the answer changed nothing. Who had spoken to the Chronicle was irrelevant. What was relevant, what was printed in 3 paragraphs in a column read by everyone who mattered in the sector, was that Ativa Group had pulled out, and done so in a way that left no room for an alternative narrative. When he entered the office, the receptionist greeted him as usual. 2 employees, who crossed paths with him in the corridor, averted their gaze a 1/10 of a second longer than normal. That 1/10 of a second was enough. Rodrigo Cavalcante had spent his entire life reading rooms. It was one of the skills he was most proud of, walking into a room and knowing, before a single word, the weight of the air. He had used it to close contracts, to fire people at the right time, to build alliances others didn't even realize were being built. Now he was using it to read his own office, and what he was reading was not good. The meeting he convened that morning with the company's directors lasted 50 minutes. He entered with his usual demeanor, spine straight, voice firm, that way of occupying the space in a room he had cultivated for years as one cultivates a tool. He presented Ativa Group's withdrawal as a strategic decision by the group, not as a consequence of anything internal. He used expressions like realigning priorities and opportunity to seek partners with a vision more aligned with ours. The directors listened, asked technical questions, took notes. But there was something in the room that wasn't in the questions or the notes. It was the silence between one speech and another. The kind of silence that exists when intelligent people are listening to one version and simultaneously calculating how much of that version they truly believe. The CFO, a 52-year-old man who had been with the company for 8 years, who had worked alongside Renata for 3 of those 8 years, and had never said this openly, but never had to, asked the last question of the meeting. And the second investor, Vector Capital. Are they still confirmed? A half-second pause, imperceptible to those not paying attention, visible to those who were. We are aligning schedules, Rodrigo replied. The meeting ended. The CFO left without looking back. Rodrigo remained in the empty room for a moment, his hands resting on the meeting table, looking at his own reflection on the glass top. Vector Capital had sent an email that morning, even before the note in the Chronicle. One line. We would like to reschedule our meeting for a date to be confirmed. Awaiting your contact. Date to be confirmed was the same as don't contact us for now. 2 investors in less than 2 weeks, without any formal notification, without any legal argument, without any battle he could fight with documents and lawyers. Just the silent weight of a reputation that had begun to crack. It was that afternoon that he made the decision that Dr. Fernanda Luz, when she learned of it, described to Renata with an expression the lawyer rarely used. He made a classic mistake, the mistake of someone with too much pride and too little patience. What Rodrigo did was call Ativa Group's representative directly, not through his agent, not through his lawyer. He himself, from his personal cell phone, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon, with the controlled voice of someone holding a lot back behind each word. The representative answered. It was a man named Claude, in his early 50s. The kind of man who builds fortunes by being exactly as polite as necessary, and never a millimeter beyond. Rodrigo said he wanted to understand the real reasons for the suspension, that there were misunderstandings that could be clarified, that the contract review process that had been initiated internally, a routine audit, nothing more had been concluded with no findings, and that any contrary information was a distortion of facts by people with personal interests in the situation. Claude listened until the end. Then he said, with the same politeness as always, Rodrigo, I appreciate the call, but group decisions are not reversed by phone call. And I must be honest, what reached us was not just the contract review, it was the way the situation was handled overall. A short pause. Good afternoon. He hung up. Rodrigo held his phone in his hand for a long moment. The way the situation was handled overall, it had never been about the contracts. It was about the dinner, it was about the legal notice, it was about the engagement announcement that had vanished from social media without explanation. It was about Isabella and her lawyer. It was about every decision he had made in recent months, with the certainty of someone who believes that money and status create a bubble that reality cannot penetrate. Reality had penetrated, and it had done so without needing a lawyer, without needing a lawsuit, without needing any visible movement. It had done so in the only way that has no defense, through the silent opinion of people who decide, without needing an audience, that they no longer want to be associated with a name. Renata learned of the call to Claude that same evening. It wasn't Mr. Afonso, this time it was Dr. Fernanda herself, who had a network of professional information built over 20 years of law practice, and used it with the discretion of someone who knows that information is a tool, not entertainment. He called Ativa Group personally, the lawyer said, tried to explain the contract review as a routine audit. He mentioned people with personal interest in the situation. Renata remained quiet for a second. He spoke of me without speaking of me. Exactly. Dr. Fernanda paused, and Claude hung up without yielding. But that's not the most important thing. What is the most important thing? The most important thing is that he tried to resolve a situation by phone that can only be resolved with time and behavior. And by doing so, he confirmed to Ativa Group that the problem isn't external. Another pause. The problem is him. Renata remained silent for a moment, and the clause in the paternity document that tries to link me to a statement about the termination, I sent the reply this afternoon. Dr. Fernanda's voice had that specific quality of containment that Renata had learned to recognize as a sign that something had been well done. I refused the clause, presented the correct legally mandated amount, and added to the document a history of the pressure attempts since the termination, date by date, action by action. A pause, including the original notice, including the contact with Mauricio before contacting me, including the parking space. The parking space? Renata repeated softly. Patterns of behavior carry weight, remember? The lawyer spoke with the same phrase she had used weeks before, but now with a different result on the other side. His lawyer will receive it early tomorrow morning, and will need to explain to his client what to do when every action he took is documented in chronological order in a formal legal brief. Renata hung up. She remained in the window chair for a while. Her son was sleeping. The city made its usual noise. She thought of Rodrigo that afternoon, calling Claude with a controlled voice, trying to recover with words what he had lost with choices, trying to convince a 50-year-old man who had built an entire career, learning to read people that the problem was external. There was something almost sad about it. Not the kind of sad that elicits pity. The kind that happens when an intelligent person uses all their intelligence in the wrong place for too long and only realizes it when the result is already printed in 3 paragraphs in a business column that everyone who matters read before breakfast. She leaned her head back in the chair. $4,200,000. One confirmed investor who had turned into date to be confirmed. A paternity document that had tried to use her son as a bargaining chip and was now being answered with a complete history of every mistake he had made. The fall had begun, and Rodrigo Cavalcante still hadn't understood that trying to stop a fall with pride does nothing. It only increases the speed. Dr. Fernanda's reply arrived in Rodrigo's lawyer's inbox on a Thursday morning. He called Rodrigo before noon. Renata was not in the room when this happened. She didn't need to be. She knew what had happened because Dr. Fernanda had developed, over 20 years of law practice, the specific ability to anticipate how the other party would react to a document, and had warned Renata the day before with her usual objectivity. When he reads it, he'll call his lawyer. The lawyer will call him, and he will do something he shouldn't do. How do you know? Because that's what people accustomed to control do when they realize they've lost control. A pause. The question isn't if he'll act poorly, it's how. The response arrived the same day, in the afternoon. Not through his lawyer, but by him directly. Renata's phone vibrated at 2:20 p.m. with Rodrigo's name on the screen. She was in the living room with her son in the baby carrier next to her, reviewing material the director of Novum Distribution had sent for her to study before starting work. Financial documents from the company's last year, the kind of thing she could read while doing 3 other things at the same time, because she had spent years training precisely that muscle. She looked at the name on the screen, took a deep breath, and answered. Rodrigo, did you see what your lawyer sent? His voice no longer had the texture of someone trying to control himself. It had the texture of someone who had tried and given up halfway. Do you know what she put in that document? Yes, Renata replied. Simple, direct. She threw everything together, the termination, the notice, the parking space, the contact with Mauricio, everything in a paternity document. That's not negotiation, that's an attack. It's a record, she corrected without changing her tone. There's a difference. Renata, his voice shifted. It dropped, acquiring that quality she had recognized other times over 8 years. Not exactly a plea, but the closest a man like Rodrigo could get to it. I know I made mistakes. I told you that personally. But what's happening now is spiraling out of control, and you know it. 2 investors have pulled back. There's a lawsuit with Isabella. The company is Rodrigo, she said. He stopped. Are you calling me to talk about the company? A silence. I'm calling because things are getting complicated in a way that isn't good for either of us. Renata remained quiet for a second, looked at her son next to her, who was sleeping with that complete and absolutely fair indifference of someone less than 2 months old, and who hadn't yet learned that the world has people who complicate their own affairs and then ask others to solve them. Listen closely to what I'm going to tell you, she said with a calm that wasn't coldness but solidity. What's happening with the company isn't my problem. What's happening with Isabella isn't my problem. The only point of contact between my life and yours from now on is our son. Any other conversation is through the lawyers. I am being clear, she said. Which is different. She hung up. She held the phone in her hand for a moment. There was no trembling, no heavy exhaustion that this type of conversation usually left. There was only the clean sensation of someone who had set a boundary and knew she would maintain it. She texted Dr. Fernanda. He called directly, spoke about the company, the investors, tried to frame it as both our problem. I set a boundary and hung up. The reply arrived in 2 minutes. Perfect. Note the time and content. I'll need it. Earlier that same day, inside the Cavalcante Solutions office, another conversation had taken place. Rodrigo had arrived at the office with the weight of the note in the Chronicle still fresh. Those 3 paragraphs that everyone who mattered had already read before breakfast. The receptionist greeted him, as always. 2 employees who crossed paths with him in the corridor averted their gaze a tenth of a second longer than normal. That tenth of a second was enough. Rodrigo Cavalcante had spent his entire life reading rooms. It was one of the skills he was most proud of, walking into a room and knowing, before a single word, the weight of the air. And what he was reading was not good. 40 minutes after arriving, the CFO entered his office without knocking. Nelson was 52 years old, 23 of them in industry companies, 8 at Cavalcante Solutions. 3 of those 8 working directly alongside Renata on every decision that had kept the company afloat in 2019. He was the kind of man who weighed every word before speaking, who never entered the boss's office without being called. That day he entered, placed a folder on the desk, stood up, and did not sit down. A detail Rodrigo noticed immediately, because Nelson was the kind of man who always sat when a conversation was going to last. This conversation was not going to last. "I came because I needed to say something personally," Nelson said, with the neutrality of someone who had chosen every word before opening the door. "The quarterly numbers are in the folder, but it's not about that." Rodrigo remained quiet. "I worked with Renata Suarez for 3 years," Nelson continued. "I was there in 2019. I know what that woman did for this company." A short pause. "And I know what happened at your father's dinner. Everyone here knows." The air in the room changed. "Nelson," Rodrigo began. "You don't need to respond," the other said simply, without aggression, with something worse than aggression, with the coldness of someone who has finished evaluating and is merely communicating the result. "I just needed you to know that I know, and I'm not the only one." He picked up the folder, walked to the door. Before leaving, he turned. "Vector Capital called me this morning. They wanted to confirm some numbers from 2019. A pause. I responded based on what I saw happen during that period. Based on the truth, he left without waiting for a reply. No fuss, no drama. Rodrigo was left alone in the room. There was nothing to say. No narrative could cover that. Nelson had worked years in that company. He had been loyal. He had been discreet. He had been exactly the type of professional Rodrigo had always valued, precisely because he had never questioned anything until now. And Vector Capital had called him. Not his agent, not his lawyer, but Nelson, the man who was there in 2019, the man who had responded based on the truth. Rodrigo sat with that information for a long moment, then picked up his phone and made the mistake that would change everything. What Renata didn't know yet was that the call had only been the warm-up. The real move came 2 days later. And it wasn't by phone. Patricia called on a Friday night with a voice Renata recognized immediately. It wasn't a tone of real emergency. It was the tone of someone trying to calibrate how to deliver information without it weighing more than it needed to. "There's something circulating," Patricia said. "In a group of entrepreneurs, Rodrigo frequents a message about you." Renata remained still. "What kind of message?" "He sent it in a WhatsApp group. There must be about 40 people in there. Partners, old clients, industry acquaintances." Patricia paused. "He wrote that you were using your pregnancy as a legal instrument to harm the company, that the documents presented at the dinner were manipulated by third parties with interests in the situation, that he was being the victim of a coordinated campaign." The silence that followed had a specific weight. It wasn't the silence of defeat. It was the silence of someone who had just seen their adversary make the mistake that changes everything. "He put that in writing," Renata said. "Not as a question. In writing. With his name on it. In his group." "Who told you?" "Duda, the name of a mutual acquaintance, wife of an entrepreneur who frequented the same circle. She left the group after reading it and sent me a screenshot before leaving." "Only she left?" "No." Patricia took a deep breath. Duda said that, right after his message, 3 replies appeared. One of the partners wrote, "Rodrigo, this isn't the place for this." Another left without saying anything, and a third. She couldn't tell me who, but they replied only one thing before leaving as well. Everyone at the dinner saw the documents. They were originals. Renata remained still. Rodrigo had sent the message thinking the group was his territory, that those 40 people were allies or at least neutral. He had forgotten, or never understood, that reputation is not loyalty, it's continuous evaluation, and people who build serious careers don't want their names associated with a narrative that publicly crumbles. "How many people left the group in total?" she asked. Duda counted 7 before she herself left. 7 people on a Friday night, leaving silently or with a single line that was worth more than an entire speech. Rodrigo had tried to regain the narrative. He had chosen the same stage as always, public, with an audience. He had done so, thinking that controlling the story meant being the first to tell it. The problem was that this time, the people in the group had seen the documents at the dinner. They knew what was true. And when he tried to construct a different version, they didn't fight him. They did something worse. They left. Renata asked for the screenshot, looked at the screen for a long moment. There it was, with time, date, Rodrigo Cavalcante's name at the top, every word chosen to appear as a victim, and below, the 3 replies and the 7 departures. Dr. Fernanda received the screenshot at 10 p.m. on Friday. She replied at 10:11 p.m. One word, excellent. Renata looked at that word for a second. She had learned that when the lawyer said excellent with such economy of words, it wasn't enthusiasm. It was the professional recognition of someone who had seen their adversary gift their own lawsuit. The call came shortly after. He just turned a paternity dispute into a defamation issue, Dr. Fernanda said directly. This screenshot is gold. He states in writing, in a group with dozens of witnesses, that you manipulated documents that were produced by him, signed by him, and that are all authenticated. A pause. This is not just a strategic error. It's material for a separate lawsuit, if you wish. I don't want a separate lawsuit, Renata replied. I want him to understand what he did. He will understand, the lawyer said. When his lawyer calls him Monday morning, explaining the size of the problem he created in a WhatsApp group on a Friday night, he will understand. The weekend passed, with a calm Renata hadn't felt in a long time. Saturday with her son, Sunday with Patricia, who appeared with food and stayed all afternoon without mentioning Rodrigo a single time, which was, in the language of the 2 sisters, the highest form of care. On Monday morning, Dr. Fernanda called, at 9:30 a.m. His lawyer contacted me. Her voice had that containment of satisfaction Renata already knew. He requested an urgent meeting, used the word sensitive 3 times in the same sentence. What did you reply? That I have availability on Thursday? A pause. He asked if there wasn't an earlier possibility. I replied no. Renata remained quiet for a second. And the WhatsApp group? Rodrigo deleted the message on Sunday night. The lawyer paused, but a screenshot doesn't disappear when the message disappears. And we have the screenshot with the time, date, and full content. Another shorter pause. Besides Duda's screenshot, I got confirmation from 2 other people who were in the group and saw it before deletion, both willing to declare it in writing, if necessary. Rodrigo had deleted the message, thinking deleting would solve it. He had probably done so in the early hours of Sunday, when the silence became too loud and his pride too small to sustain what he had written. Too late. The digital world has a memory that doesn't ask permission to retain. The Thursday meeting took place at her office in the financial district at 2 p.m. Renata was not present. It wasn't necessary, and it wasn't appropriate. It was a meeting between lawyers, and lawyers work better without the emotional weight of clients in the room. She stayed in her apartment with her son, waiting. Dr. Fernanda called at 4:40 p.m. He wants a settlement. Renata took a deep breath. What kind of settlement? He withdraws the clause from the paternity document, accepts the legally mandated amounts, commits not to make any public statements about you, about the documents, or about any aspect of the termination. The lawyer paused. In exchange, you don't file a defamation lawsuit regarding the group message and the contract review. The narrative he tried to construct about 2019, formally closed, with a written declaration that there were no irregularities. Dr. Fernanda's voice had the specific quality of someone delivering the result of work that cost a lot and was worth every penny, signed by him with notarization. Renata's silence lasted only a second. I want to read the document before anything else. I expected that. I'm sending it now. The document arrived in 2 minutes. Renata read it with her usual care, line by line, without haste, without letting any word pass without its weight. Her son slept next to her. The afternoon light poured through the window. It was all there. The correct amounts. The clause withdrawn. The declaration about 2019. The commitment to public silence. Rodrigo Cavalcante, who had begun that story with a speech at a party in front of 200 people, was now signing a paper that stated in legal language, but with absolute clarity, that he had been wrong, that the documents were true, that she had done nothing wrong, that she had told the truth the entire time. Renata placed her phone on the table, looked at her son. There was a cost to this, not for her, but for him. Not the cost of the settlement itself, but the cost of having reached that point, of having chosen, at every fork in the road in recent months, the path of control instead of the path of honesty, of having spent energy, money, reputation, and the respect of people who mattered trying to erase someone who simply could not be erased. That cost wasn't in the document. It was in everything that had happened before it. And Rodrigo would carry that cost for much longer than the paper would be kept in a folder. She picked up her phone, sent one word to Dr. Fernanda. Sign. But signing a settlement doesn't close all doors. It closes some, the ones with legal locks, the ones with witnesses, the ones that fit on paper with notarization. The others, the ones that exist in company corridors, in lunch conversations, in the memory of investors who postponed meetings indefinitely, in social media feeds where an engagement announcement had vanished without explanation. Those doors remained open, and Rodrigo Cavalcante would have to pass through each of them, without a document to help, without a narrative to sustain him, without the woman who had held everything together while he slept soundly, and who was now on the other side of a line he himself had drawn in the sand. The situation was more serious than before, only this time he knew it. Novum Distribution had a custom of holding an annual dinner with partners, suppliers, and industry guests. It wasn't a gala event. It was the kind of dinner that exists to build and maintain relationships, round tables, good conversation, the kind of environment where deals aren't closed, but are started. Director Henry Bastos had personally invited Renata 3 weeks before the date, with a simple justification. You haven't officially started yet, but you're already part of the family. And the right people need to meet you before your first day. She had accepted. The event took place on a Thursday evening at a venue called the Willow Creek Estate, a spacious hall, adequate lighting, neither excessive nor sparse. The kind of place that communicates seriousness without needing to shout. Renata arrived on time, simple dress, her usual posture, her son at home with Patricia, who had insisted on staying so her sister could truly be present, without half her mind elsewhere. She entered, greeted Henry Bastos at the entrance. He introduced her to the first groups, with the natural ease of someone introducing a person whose value they already know, even before meeting them. Renata Suarez, our new CFO. Anyone in the logistics sector has probably already heard the name. Some faces signaled recognition, others curiosity. She responded to each greeting with the same measure: presence without ostentation, firmness without rigidity. She had learned long ago that the most powerful way to enter a room is not needing to prove anything to be in it. She hadn't planned what happened next. There was no way to plan. She was at the second table, in conversation with 2 mid-sized suppliers and Novum's sales manager, when she heard the voice. She didn't need to turn around. She recognized it before turning. Rodrigo Cavalcante was 3 tables away. He had arrived as a guest of one of Novum's partners, a transport company with whom Cavalcante Solutions had maintained a commercial relationship for years. It wasn't his event. He hadn't been invited by Henry Bastos. He was there as a third party's companion, in the kind of situation where a man accustomed to being the center of attention finds himself occupying the periphery. Renata noticed this in a second. She also noticed, because it was impossible not to notice, the exact moment he saw her. It was like watching someone stumble without falling. His body gave a minimal, almost imperceptible sign. A half-step pause, a readjustment of posture, a stiffening in his shoulders that lasted less than 2 seconds, but which she knew as one knows a language spoken for years. He didn't expect to find her there, and more than not expecting it, he wasn't prepared for what she represented in that environment. Not the ex-girlfriend, not the woman who had been humiliated in a ballroom. She represented the CFO of Novum Distribution, invited by the owner, introduced as part of the family, someone who had built a new place while he lost control of the old. The first 40 minutes of dinner continued without direct contact. Renata conversed, listened, asked the right questions, answered with her usual precision. She built her presence in the way she always had, not with volume, but with substance. Rodrigo circulated in his own confined space. The transport company that had brought him had a table in the opposite corner. He stayed there with a glass in his hand, and the posture of someone trying to occupy less space than his own body. Those who knew both of them, and there were at least 4 people in that hall who knew, were noticing. The first was Mauricio Andrade. Renata hadn't known he would be there. Mauricio had connected with Novum through a commercial partnership in the south, and Henry Bastos had invited him as part of the industry's network. When he appeared next to her with a glass of water and a sideways smile, she felt something that wasn't surprise. It was the confirmation that the world, when it stops being controlled by a false narrative, tends to reorganize itself around the truth. "You look well," he said simply. "I am," she replied, in the same way. "I saw you're joining Novum." "Yes, in 2 weeks." Mauricio nodded. He stood for a moment next to her in conversation with the suppliers, contributed naturally, and then said softly, without drama, "He's been looking over here since you arrived." "I know." Are you going to talk to him? If he comes over, I'll listen. If not, it's not necessary. Mauricio looked at her for a second. There was in him the specific respect of someone who had been on the right side in a difficult situation and didn't need recognition for it, but recognized when the other side had reached where they deserved to be. All right, he said, and went back to his own conversation. It was Henry Bastos who unintentionally created the moment, or perhaps he knew exactly what he was doing. In the middle of dinner, he lightly tapped the microphone and gave a short speech. The kind of speech company owners give at these events. Thanks to partners, mention of the past year, looking forward, 2-3 sentences per topic, no exaggeration. At the end, he said, and I want to formally introduce someone who will be joining our family starting next month. Renata Suarez, our new CFO. Anyone who has worked with her in the logistics sector knows what this hiring represents for Novum. Some applause. Renata acknowledged it with a simple nod, without standing. Mauricio applauded with that specific conviction of someone being genuine, not just polite. Rodrigo was 4 tables away. He didn't applaud. He held his glass, motionless, looking at the table in front of him. And the 2 or 3 people sitting near him at that moment, industry people, people who knew both sides of the story, turned discreetly to see his reaction. There was no reaction. There was only a man who had said months earlier at a party with 200 people that Renata no longer belonged anywhere, watching a company owner introduce her as part of the family in front of the entire industry, unable to do anything but hold his glass. Rodrigo came to speak with her 20 minutes later, not immediately. He waited for the atmosphere to relax, for conversations to become more casual, but when he walked toward her, there were at least 6 people who saw and didn't pretend not to be seeing. He stopped next to her. She was standing between tables, with a glass of water in her hand. Renata. She turned, looked him in the eyes, as she always had, without flinching, without hardening beyond what was necessary. Rodrigo. There were 3 people less than 6 feet away. None pretended not to be listening. Are you well? He asked. His voice had a quality she hadn't often heard in him. Not the practiced firmness, not the meeting cadence. It was something rawer, more tired. I am, she replied. Are you? He paused for a second, as if the question back to him was something he hadn't expected. I wanted to. He started, stopped, restarted. I needed to tell you personally that the settlement wasn't enough. That I know that. The hall continued with its normal noise, but around the 2 of them, there was that localized silence that exists when a group of people decides, without agreement, to give total attention to a moment. Renata didn't answer immediately. When she did, it was softly. Not because she was hiding, but because what she had to say didn't need an audience, even if there was one. You're right. The settlement wasn't enough. A pause. But it's not for me that you need to be enough, Rodrigo. It's for the son who is growing up without knowing you yet. He closed his eyes for a second. It was that second that the people around saw, not the words. They were too soft. But the second of closed eyes of a 4-1-year-old man who had built an empire and at that moment had nowhere to place the weight of what he had done. That was visible from any distance. Mauricio was 10 feet away. He saw it. Novum's sales manager was 6 feet away. She saw it. And Henry Bastos, who had approached naturally during the conversation without interfering, was 12 feet away. When Rodrigo's eyes opened, the 2 met for an instant. Henry Bastos said nothing. He didn't need to. There was in his gaze the clear and silent reading of a man who had spent his entire life evaluating people and had just confirmed live everything he had needed to evaluate. Rodrigo realized, and it was that realization, not Renata's words, not the signed settlement, not the investors who had pulled back. It was that look from Henry Bastos in a hall where he was a visitor, and she was part of the family that made something crack inside Rodrigo Cavalcante in a way that documents cannot describe, because documents record facts. What? Crack there wasn't a fact. It was the final layer of an illusion he had maintained with enormous effort for too long. The illusion that the world saw the situation the way he had constructed it to be seen. The world didn't see it that way. The world was seeing exactly what it was. And in that hall, on that night, with Mauricio by her side and Henry Bastos facing him, Rodrigo Cavalcante understood something no lawyer, no document, and no well-constructed narrative had managed to make him understand before. He had gone to the wrong dinner. He left before the end. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. There was no one to say goodbye to. The host of the dinner was by Renata's side. The witness who had saved the documents was by Renata's side. The entire industry was looking at Renata. He placed his glass on the nearest table, and exited through the side corridor, with the hurried step of someone trying to appear as if they have an urgent commitment. There was no commitment. There was only the need to leave a place where every extra second cost something he no longer had to spend. Mauricio passed Renata a few minutes later and said in passing, "He left." She nodded, asked nothing more. The night continued. She talked to 3 more people, finalized 2 alignment points with the sales manager, and left the Willow Creek estate at 10 p.m. with the specific feeling of someone who did what they set out to do and did it well. In the taxi, on the way home, she looked out the window. She thought of Mr. Afonso's party hall. 200 people, the dress Rodrigo had chosen, the words spoken with the precision of someone rehearsing. "You no longer belong here." And she thought of that hall that night, where she had been introduced on the microphone by the company owner, where Mauricio had applauded with the conviction of someone being genuine, where Henry Bastos had read the situation and confirmed what he had already decided, where Rodrigo had left through the side corridor before the end, unnoticed. The taxi stopped in front of her apartment. She went up. Patricia was on the sofa with her son in her arms, both sleeping with that silent complicity of those who found mutual comfort without planning it. Renata stood at the door for a moment, looking at the 2 of them. Then she went over, sat next to her sister, and remained silent for a long time. "How was it?" Patricia asked without opening her eyes. "It was," Renata replied. Her sister nodded, asked nothing more. Because sometimes, "it was" is the most complete answer there is. But outside, that same night, somewhere in that city, Rodrigo Cavalcante was alone with the weight of having left a hall through the side corridor for the first time in his life, and still didn't know that the most difficult part was yet to come. Mr. Afonso's call came on a Monday morning, 10 days after the dinner. It was early. The kind of time when Mr. Afonso only called when the matter couldn't wait for the world to properly wake up. Renata answered with her son in her arms, still in the dimness of the apartment, with the city outside making the warm noise of a weekday morning. "Rodrigo requested a leave of absence from the company," the old man said directly, without preamble. "Yesterday afternoon, he informed the board in writing. Temporary leave, for an indefinite period, for personal reasons." Renata remained quiet. The board accepted. Accepted because they had no choice. The company is operating, but the 2 investors are still in a holding pattern. The CFO has taken over in an interim capacity, and Rodrigo hadn't truly been present at internal meetings for 2 weeks. Mr. Afonso paused. He was there, but he wasn't there. She knew that distinction. She had spent years being the person who was truly present, while others were only physically in the room. "Are you well?" she asked. A long pause. The kind that exists when a 6, 8-year-old man is weighing what it means to see his son arrive at a place that cannot be undone. "I'm old," he said, not as an answer to the question, but as a realization of something larger. "I spent my life building a company to pass on to him, and now I'm watching him distance himself from it for reasons he himself created." Another pause. "It's not what I wanted for him, Renata. I need you to know that." "I know, Mr. Afonso, and it's not what I wanted for you." She didn't reply. There was only the real weight of a story that hadn't ended the way anyone had planned. "He'll want to see you," the old man said. "I don't know when, but he will. If he comes, I'll listen," she replied. "But it doesn't change anything that's already been decided." "I know." A final pause. "I just wanted you to know before he shows up." They hung up. Renata held her son, looking out the window. The morning light poured in with that Monday glow that promises nothing but another day. Cavalcante Solutions' interim CFO was Nelson, the same man who had walked into Rodrigo's office unannounced, placed the folder on the desk, and said with the coldness of someone who had finished evaluating, "Everyone here knows." Now he was in Rodrigo's place, without drama, without speeches, just sitting in the chair. Rodrigo had left vacant because he could no longer sustain it. Rodrigo appeared the following Saturday. He hadn't given notice. The doorbell rang at 10 a.m. Renata heard the sound and paused for a second, not out of hesitation, but out of a deliberate choice about how she wanted to receive that moment. She opened the door. He was different from all other times. There was no practiced posture, no calibrated voice, no suit that functioned as armor. He was in simple clothes, the face of someone who hadn't slept enough for days on end, and in his eyes, that crack that had appeared at the Willow Creek estate and had only deepened since then. "Can I come in?" he asked. "You can." He entered. He stood in the living room, looking at the apartment he had once called an unnecessary studio apartment, which now had a crib in the next room, simple flowers in a jar on the kitchen table, and the unmistakable presence of a place that truly belonged to someone. Her son was in the baby carrier, awake, making those small sounds of someone who had just discovered they had a voice and didn't yet know what to do with it. Rodrigo looked at him, took a step toward the baby carrier, bent down slightly, and the baby, who had been calm until then, began to cry. Not a soft cry, but the cry of a baby who doesn't recognize the smell, doesn't recognize the voice, doesn't recognize anything in that approaching face. Rodrigo recoiled, stood 3 feet away, looking at his crying son, his hands not knowing where to rest. Open, closed, open again. And, on his face, the expression of someone who had just understood, concretely and without appeal, what it means to be too late. It wasn't a metaphor, it wasn't a narrative. It was a baby who didn't know him. Renata went to her son, picked him up with that easy gesture of someone who is already recognized, and the crying stopped in seconds. The baby settled into her arms like coming home. Rodrigo stood in the middle of the room watching this, and there was nothing that hurt more than that simple scene. The woman he had pointed out at a party and said no longer belonged anywhere, being the only place where his son felt safe. He remained silent for a long time. When he spoke, his voice had dropped to a place she had never heard in him. I came because I needed to tell you something without lawyers, without documents, without anyone in between. Renata waited. I know what I did, he continued. Not just what I did to you, what I did to the company, to my father, to everyone at that dinner. He stopped. I spent years thinking that controlling the narrative was the same as controlling reality. A long pause. It's not, is it? She listened until he finished. When he finished, she remained silent for a moment, not to punish, but because what she had to say needed to land with the right weight. I hear what you're saying, she said, and I believe you're truly saying it. A pause. But believing isn't the same as starting over, and recognizing doesn't erase what happened. He didn't respond. He knew there was no response. What exists between us now is this son. Only that. She looked at him with her usual directness. And he just showed you what 8 months of absence costs. It wasn't me who showed you, it was him. A short pause. Without cruelty, but without backing down. You will need to build this from scratch, visit by visit, presence by presence. And it will take time, because children don't forgive with speeches, they forgive with time. Rodrigo looked at his son in her arms. Can I try to hold him? He asked. His voice, in that simple question, had dropped to a place without any protection. Renata went to the baby carrier, carefully placed her son back in it, and took a step aside. You try, she said. Rodrigo approached slowly, bent his body with that excessive care of someone who has never done this before and is afraid of making a mistake. He placed his hands under his son with an insecurity that had nothing of pretense. The baby began to frown. Rodrigo remained motionless, unsure whether to advance or retreat, his hands supporting a small weight that at that moment seemed heavier than anything he had carried in his life. The baby didn't cry. He remained at the edge, that place of a baby where the world can still be good or bad, depending on what happens in the next second. Rodrigo remained still like that for a long time, motionless, holding, not knowing what to do with his hands, not knowing what to say, without any of the tools he had used his entire life to control situations. Just a man holding a son, who hadn't yet decided if he trusted him. And that scene, that disarmed, insecure man, small in the middle of a room he had called unnecessary, was more than any document had managed to describe. It was the real consequence of every wrong choice. Renata stood 6 feet away, neither approaching nor retreating, just staying where she was, whole, firm, in the center of her own space. He left 40 minutes later, without grand promises, with the practical understanding that his lawyer would contact Dr. Fernanda to define regular visits, with confirmation that the agreed-upon amounts would be met. At the door, he paused for a second, said nothing. There was nothing to say that would come close to being enough. Renata closed the door, stood in the hall for a moment, then returned to the living room, picked up her son, and sat in the window chair. 3 weeks later, the Business Chronicle published a 2-line note in its business column. Cavalcante Solutions had announced an internal restructuring. Nelson Gomez, interim CFO, formally assumed the general directorship of the company. Rodrigo Cavalcante remained a minority shareholder, without executive function, minority shareholder, in the company that had been built with his name on the facade. Patricia sent a message when the note came out, without comment, just the link. Renata read it once. She placed her phone on the table. There was no excessive satisfaction, no celebration. There was something deeper and quieter than that. The silent recognition of someone who had sown honesty for years, was publicly humiliated for it, and lived to see the earth return every single thing it had received, for the right side and for the wrong side. Ativa Group did not return. Vector Capital did not return. The accountant who had been hired to build a false narrative did not return. The engagement did not return. The image of the unshakable man did not return. Isabella had moved on with her son, far away, without publication, without a note, without the man who had announced her pregnancy as the greatest joy of his life. And 3 weeks later, he was signing a legal settlement with another woman who carried a child by the same father. The business world knew everything. The business world always knows. And Rodrigo Cavalcante, who had entered that story as the man who pointed to a woman in front of 200 people and said she no longer belonged in his place, had left as a minority shareholder of a company that was once his, father of a son who cried when he approached, and a man who had to sign a notarized document acknowledging that he had lied. Not in secret, but with notarization. Renata remained in the window chair for a long time. That afternoon, her son slept in her arms. The city made its eternal noise outside. The apartment, which had been called unnecessary, was quiet and whole and full of the life she had built with her own hands, while they tried to erase her. There was no speech at the end. There was no moment when the villain kneels publicly with cameras pointed. Real life doesn't work that way, but it works in its own way, in its own time, with the silent precision of someone who doesn't need an audience to collect what is owed. Rodrigo had chosen the stage, had chosen the audience, had chosen every word carefully to humiliate her in front of 200 people. And in the end, it was precisely the stage that destroyed him, because the same people who witnessed the humiliation also witnessed the fall, and the fall was much greater. Renata brought her face close to her son's face. He opened his eyes, looked at her with that absolute concentration of a baby still learning the world, and recognized her immediately, without hesitation, without the frown that had appeared when Rodrigo approached. He just recognized her and smiled. The first true smile, not the involuntary reflex of the first days, a real, directed smile, chosen for her. Renata looked at that smile for a long moment and breathed. Deep, clean, without any weight. She had reached the other side, whole,